It's obviously very important for us to acknowledge that we're on Kaurna land today and acknowledge elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are watching or participating in this webinar today. And as always, I like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders on level 4 in this building who are doing the really important work in improving health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'd like to thank them for all their hard work. But today, as I said, we've got a really impressive lineup. We have Professor Carolyn McMillen, Chief Scientist for South Australia, who's going to give us a short presentation about the South Australian Productivity Commission report on health and medical research in South Australia. A really important report, and one that I hope will lead to vast improvements in our health and medical research productivity over time. After Carolyn's given her presentation, we have this outstanding panel with Professor Lesley Dwyer, the Chief Executive Officer of CALHN, right next door to us. Professor Ben Kile, who's the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences at the University of Adelaide, and Professor Maria Makrides, who's the Deputy Director here at SAHMRI and Theme Leader for SAHMRI Women and Kids. So an outstanding panel and an outstanding speaker to lead us into our discussion about the South Australian Productivity Commission report on health and medical research. So I think we'll go straight to Carolyn.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Steve. I have 8 minutes and 8 slides, so I'm going to try, for me, that's going to defy the laws of physics, so I'll give it a go. Now, look, as Steve has said, this is a key report. It's a key report because it was set against a backdrop of significant issues arising reasonably over the last couple of decades. And the diagnostic, what in a sense prompted a focus on health and medical research in South Australia, was evidence that there had been a decline, and a decline in health and medical research grant funding. We're a proud state. Our health medical research is up there in the world in quality, but seeing that decline, particularly in national share of health and medical research funding for the state, meant that a focus on the contributing factors and, more importantly, the solutions was merited. And so the Premier Commission, the South Australia Productivity Commission, as you know. Now, it's a very detailed report. It's an empirical, evidence-based report, which I know all of you will be really supportive of. So just really the major contributing factors. These are the words I've used of the SAPC rather than trying to bring my own particular words or summary. The contributing factors were well enunciated by the myriad of submissions. There was a combination of state policy and governance changes which appeared and had in fact reduced priority for health and medical research in our public health system. And this occurred over time. Together with a loss of health medical research workforce capability in public hospitals as a consequence of that reduced priority, and also actually in universities. There was a conclusion or a statement that there appeared to have been a preference for investing in buildings to support health medical research rather than in research leaders to support health and medical research. And there's obviously issues arising from that statement. A lack of strategic leadership as the priority for health and medical research declined in the department. There was a lack of leadership in consequence and in parallel from the state's health department, and a very complex and to some extent inefficient regulatory environment, cluttered environment in fact, and framework for support services such as ethics, clearance and so forth for health and medical research. And altogether as well, we then had the relocation, of course, of the RA from one end to the other end of North Terrace and protracted capital development program. These were the major contributing factors identified, and the conclusion based on not only these disruptors, as it were, but also the clear evidence of the impact on health and medical research was that long-term reform is fundamental if we are to secure more funding and lift our scale, our competitiveness and productivity, including the opportunity to translate innovation arising from research, translate that innovation into the clinic, the community and practice. So we're in a sense aware of that. Those who've lived through that are reasonably alert to the experience, the lived experience of each of those contributing factors. Now on the next slide, we actually see a little bit more of a deep dive by the Commission from around 2015, comparing South Australia to the rest of Australia. Australia nationally shifted to establishing a higher priority for clinical research and translation, a welcome shift, a welcome move. But at that same moment, South Australia appears in fact to have been slower in responding to this change than the states with which we faced fierce competition for funding. The leading performers in other states really took up the mantle of great clinical research led by top clinical world-class researchers, often recruited, jointly appointed to a hospital or affiliated university or research institute. Clearly, South Australia has top clinical researchers, but what we saw, and on the right-hand side, you'll see the table from the report, we saw that in each of our local health networks, there was almost an inexorable decline, and here we're using clinical academics as some kind of proxy, a decline across that period in what you might say was that clinical academic, or to some extent clinical researcher population. The country was going one way and we were going another. So the next slide then looks to the health medical research workforce. And I think on this webinar, none of us would query the opening statement that a productive workforce is a critical foundation for world-class research. And it calls for focused efforts across the ecosystem by different institutions to ensure that ongoing investment, not only in the top research leaders, but also their teams. The development of those teams is critical, of early and mid-career researchers, and a real commitment to the global standards that we're all familiar with that must be emphasized era after era in research, and particularly health and medical research. We have many researchers in South Australia carrying the global flag for South Australia across the world. But nevertheless, if we're not building the leadership, if we're not building the next generation, then that becomes a resource that does run lower and to some extent no longer provides the taking the stage so much for South Australia. Now, in the Commission's view, the heavy lifting in all of these efforts largely rests with the universities and hospital networks including LHNs, private sector, and separately research institutes. And so reasonably, the Commission was drawing attention to the fact that we have to look inside our institutions for our own programs and policies and programs. And we have to, in a sense, be alert and aware to how the development of talent occurs within our respective organisations. In the next slide, so I focus particularly on that workforce piece arising out of a kind of core finding reasonably for the SAPC. However, moving forward, so reasonably the reforms required, the funding required, the voice of South Australian health medical researchers to a person are focused perhaps more on the funding than they may be on reforms. But together, it's reforms and funding that are required in moving forward. So what did the SAPC say about this? Well, firstly, it took into account where SA Health had to go, strengthened accountability, strengthened emphasis on performance for health and medical research, making it a priority to underpin great clinical, community health and public health outcomes. They were clear there had to be an alignment of priorities in any plan, and incentives between the players, as it were, the institutions who constitute the health medical research ecosystem to deliver those priorities. And that the focus should be on South Australia's fields of actual or potential and important strengths. A clear enabling, monitoring and evaluation role for the Department of Health and Wellbeing, reasonably saying this is in the purview of the state and we have to be able to keep a careful eye on our position, both in the priorities that come through, the delivery against those, and performance against Australia and the world. Taking up the mantle again. A reform of governance of SAHMRI was also highlighted in the reforms required to enable it to become what was called a fully independent medical research institute with a particular absolute focus on excellence. Now, interestingly, in funding, the caveat statements were made that it wasn't clear to the Commission whether additional funding above the budgets that would be established from finding existing funding, such as that provided to the state by the Australian government in its hospital funding envelope, together with the proceeds of continuous improvement in LHNs, and together with redirecting existing state funds, whether additional funding above those key components would be needed to achieve the regeneration of health and medical research. This is going to be fiercely discussed and debated today, I have no doubt, but that was their conclusion. They also stated that the catalytic funds for health and medical research in the local health networks should be directed to rebuilding that capability in clinical research and translation that had been lost, building that continuous improvement to develop those next generation of health and medical researchers, and improvement in the health and medical research culture, which had been lost over time. So the reforms needed. There was also some decluttering, good housekeeping, really key factors that have completely caused real irritation, loss of time, and a sense of disenfranchisement from the systems that people work within in health and medical research. Addressing the regulatory framework by streamlining research ethics and data and governance approval processes writ large in submissions, and being very well addressed by Health Translation as a clinical governance review committee, but continuing to need absolute focus. Of course, the workforce capabilities, absolutely clearly, again, unlocking our state's data through improvements in the data systems and linkage capabilities and digital enablement. Being really clear that commercialisation and translation capacity to really ensure those outcomes come through the public health system to really support health medical research and bring an enhancement of the management of intellectual property. This was found to be wanting. And reform the actual architecture within which health and medical research occurs to enable, again, excellent clinical research. So we have major reforms in funding, the architectural structure, the governance, the framing of priorities, and then we have the pieces that daily cause blockages for researchers trying to deliver against major funding sources. And just a piece reasonably, if we could just move forward 2 slides, thank you. Just the next one, go to the next one if you could. Thank you. And so reasonably in moving forwards, there were 2, I think, key statements. Having listened to many a public forum and many public discussions and seen the inputs and discussed, and obviously, as we all have with the SAPC, some of that feedback, there is a moving forwards in leadership, in culture, and in collaboration. I think one of the key points was the role of SAHMRI itself, either deemed to be a place where every last dollar of health funds went and they weren't available anywhere else, or deemed to be an opportunity for the state to have a strong medical research institute at scale. And so this comment, I think, is important in that context for us to move forwards. The statement that indeed SAHMRI has made a positive contribution to the state's effort and health and medical research, despite issues in governance, which are then addressed in the SAPC report with suggestions to move forwards. And whilst it has indeed been criticised by some stakeholders as lacking direction and focused research priorities, and as absorbing most or all of the government's funding, the Commission considers this perception, that criticism and that perception, to be a significant overstatement of reality. And I think that's a really good position to think through the evidence presented by the Commission for that, and in a sense, to be able to move forwards. And the final piece, which was a second piece, I think, again, on leadership, culture and collaboration, was that the view of the community is, what is an innovation district? What is the role of Adelaide Biomed City beyond the precinct and its nice buildings? What does it offer the future? And in fact, the view of the SAPC was it did offer a future. If you could work with, in a sense, the mandate that exists between those buildings and institutions, and establish what a health, innovation and translation district can look like as other models may appear across South Australia. And a great deal of work, it's noted, is required to realise this ambition. But what we can see in that diagram below is the return for that work. We can see this is just a picture of how a cluster with a university collaboration or a hospital alongside that university campus can move forwards to form a precinct. If you're adding in medical research institution, you're bringing in some commercialization of R&D, bringing in some startups, some clinician entrepreneurship, innovation in health translating to med and health tech within a precinct. Now grow that precinct by adding in those new technologies, the platform technologies, the AI, the new imaging approaches, the way in which new molecular structures and their interactions can be identified by new enabling technology processes, take the augmentation of human ability. So if we begin to add in, converge other disciplines within an innovation district, what we see along that continuum is a lift in productivity for our health and medical research effort through collaboration to drive an uplift in translation of 20%, and then at scale, more than half of what can come about from that very base cluster. That's been demonstrated globally. There are plenty of models working, and many of you are very, very aware of those. And so I think that was a reasonable statement. Now I'm just going, my final slide is just 2 slides back to the dark one. Thank you, Tamara. Thank you very much. The dark one, it's there. So finally, I have to say, as Chief Scientist and Excite, for me, the SAPC Health Medical Research Report was a great example of when you develop and inquire on the national and international standing of the excellence of our work, the collaboration between researchers and hospitals and researchers in industry settings, and what that ranks against, again, the world, and how we can pull through collaboration with health medical research, with the clinic, in the community and in public health, the innovation that's required for a business or for a social transition by translating that. And critically and important in this absolutely seminal piece of work, we need an enabled future workforce, or else that research and innovation value chain goes slowly and will go to a stop. We were at risk of that. We saw it in time. There are people who've worked very hard to maintain momentum. And so taking the lessons from the report are key, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carolyn. Great talk, great slides, and a great summary. So thank you very much. I'm going to move now, firstly, to Lesley. And I think what Carolyn outlined was that the alignment of the institutions, that is the LHNs and particularly the Royal Adelaide Hospital, the university, and in this case, particularly the University of Adelaide, and obviously SAHMRI and the Medical Research Institutes, was really important. I'm going to ask Lesley, does she see an alignment of priorities occurring? Do we need to do that better and faster? And to Carolyn's point, when the Commission said no extra funding would be made available, can we do it without extra funding? Or are there other sources of extra funding? So that's my question to you, Lesley.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for that very small question, very simple. So I think I'll start by saying that, you know, we can always do things better and faster. And I think that probably for all of the reasons that Caroline explained, from a CALHN perspective, we've taken a little bit of time, I think, to be able to find our place on this precinct. And some of that is just an artefact of timing. You know, the organisation was very distracted by the build and then the move. But the good news is that we're not starting from scratch, and that we've got some, you know, sort of pretty amazing and world-class research on which to build from. But to go to your specific question, I think we already are starting to make those moves. As many people who will be listening in know, we have, you know, almost not preempted, but because in fact it was exactly the right thing to do. And a lot of it came through the work that was happening around the Adelaide Biomed City Board, which was establishing the Adelaide Health Innovation Partnership, which is a partnership between SAHMRI, CALHN and the University of Adelaide, and Women's and Children's are also part of what we're calling RHIP, because we do like an acronym. And this was very much around making sure that we played to our strengths and chose some things that we felt could really set us apart, not just as a precinct. And if I look at Caroline's definitions, we might still be a bit cluster-like, but moving rapidly to being a precinct. And you know, we've determined that we do have some strengths. One is around cancer research. The other one is around Aboriginal health, but also it is around, you know, sort of using that big data, you know, sort of that digital health hub, which again, you know, sort of is other people may have actually come up with those ideas and started to progress them. But we now have a vehicle that makes sure that this is not only a commitment of individuals, because I think that that's where we have had a strength in the past. It has been actually the fabulous work by individual researchers, bits of the organisation backing them. And we have pivoted now that it is really an organisational priority, and our boards are involved with this and are really sort of pushing us in that direction. I think, you know, the question around, you know, sort of can we do more? Do we have enough money to invest in that? Look, you know, sort of, and again, I can only talk from CALHN. We get about $35 million of research revenue in each year. Now, you know, sort of, I know when I, you know, talk to my, you know, interstate colleagues, they'll just go, you know, isn't that little? But in actual fact, can we do better with it? And, you know, about 20 million of that is in grant revenue and 15 million is in sponsor revenue. Where I don't think that we have worked collectively is to think about, instead of trying to give out little bits to everybody, so can I give a grant here and a grant here, is let's now try and align our priorities so that we can get that really early uplift, that we can start to scale up quite significantly. You know, we also, you know, sort of receive donations. They go through the Hospital Charitable Gifts Board. We have great support through the Hospital Research Foundation and the RA Research Foundation. But what we've never done is really say, for the next X amount of years, this is where we want to put in a priority. I do want to make, if I can, about a comment that was made by Caroline, but sort of implied in your question, which is around funding. And this is not about where I think funding goes, but it's just a reminder that within South Australia public hospitals, we are given 100% of the national efficient price. That's unusual because in other jurisdictions, they're given a percentage of it, of which government then has the rest of it, which they can invest. There is a quantum in there, not only for teaching and training, but also for research. And so we need to be able to say, in being an efficient organisation, if you're an organisation that attracts that, then you have to know how much of that is done in the touching time and how much of that is around giving you the ability to invest in research and translation. And I don't think that we have been very good, you know, sort of in that aspect. But hopefully, just to give the, you know, people that are listening in a little bit of hope, in the service level agreements for the very first time, the department is starting to put in some indicators around research, very clear about trying to get some of that efficiency, the things that get in your way, you know, as researchers each and every day about, you know, duplication of processes, etc. But in actual fact, from a CALHN perspective, our board have added many more of them. They like to give me a few KPIs. And so I think that, you know, sort of we have got the ability, but not singularly, to do things. And it's only by working together with the university. For us, with SAHMRI, we have, you know, sort of this wonderful research institute that sort of almost becomes, you know, the focal point around us. You know, we're going to have women's and children's coming on board. You know, we actually do have to pick up the pace because we've got a lot to gain. And potentially we don't want to continue to lose some ground.
Thank you very much, Lesley. Great points. I was going to make the point about time. I'm going to take this over the 5 o'clock to 5:15 if I can, because we have such a good panel here and a really important issue to discuss. And I hope our participants can stay on board. But Ben, sort of the same, I won't repeat the question, but the same question I put to Lesley. Obviously, the other key institution is the university, and your alignment with what Carolyn was saying.
Well, without sounding too glib, I think it's fair to say that one of the things that's really impressed me since arriving in Adelaide 18 months ago into the university and the precinct is the alignment across the organisations. I'm conscious of the history. I'm conscious of the fact that if we take that precinct at the Western End for a start, it's new. In Australian terms, as far as these precincts go, it's brand new, and there's obviously been a lot of difficulties in adjusting to the new precinct and starting to figure out how organisations are going to function internally. And I think in the last year or two, we've started to see the organisations realise that they're best working together. And the SAPC, I think, has done a really nice job of cataloguing our collective shortcommes in a really positive way. And I think we all had a piece of that puzzle, and I think seeing it all brought together was a really important milestone for South Australia. The challenge now for us as leaders and organisations, as researchers and healthcare professionals, the challenge for SA Health, the challenge for government, is to actually start to address some of those issues. And Lesley's touched on some of those initiatives, as has Carolyn. I think from the university's perspective, obviously we see opportunities to engage, not just in the research agenda, which I could talk for hours about, but education as well, and that workforce component that the SAPC identified. And if you just take the clinician researcher element of that report, the G08 universities have just prepared what I think is a really good report that's gone to the Medical Workforce Advisory Committee, and that really highlights the need for us to put in place a structured pipeline to generate the clinician researchers of the future. This is already happening in Melbourne and is kicking off in Queensland, and I think most states have aspirations to try and put something together. The model that the G08's advocating for, they're calling the Australian Integrated Clinician Researcher Training Pathway. And rather than an MD, PhD program, like the American model where medical students do a PhD throughout the course of their medical degree, this is really based on a model where folks who've already graduated from medicine and in specialist training programs do a structured PhD as part of that. And it's off to a start in Parkville in Melbourne, and what it requires to really function, and I think people are really excited about what's happening in Melbourne. What it requires is universities, medical research institutes and hospitals and health systems working together. It's not a huge program yet in Parkville, but the enthusiasm, the excitement and the quality of applicants has got everyone really excited about what's going to come from that. So obviously, wearing my university hat, I see a huge opportunity for the university to partner with SAHMRI and with CALHN and with the other health networks, I hope, and of course with SA Health and Government to put a program like that in place. It doesn't have to be huge. We can be creative. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the Parkville model. But what I see across Adelaide now is that willingness to do something different, to work together, to start to collectively address what we know has been a relative decline in our competitiveness nationally in an area that was fundamentally important to the South Australian community before COVID, but post-COVID is front and centre in the state's agenda. And I think we've got every reason to be really positive about this year and the coming decade as the precinct beds down, exciting new developments springing out of the ground and others to come. I think really getting that organisational collaboration functioning as effectively as possible is the challenge we have to address.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks. That was very, very good. Thank you. And Maria, as a clinical trialist and an author of some fantastic clinical trials, and there was some stuff in that Carolyn talked about a cluttered environment, some governance issues. What did you take out of all of that?
What did I take out of all of that? That there's system improvements that are really needed. I guess a lot of work is happening and has been happening to improve ethics and governance processes. But I guess even beyond that, we also need the system issues that even before we can actually get to ethics and governance approval, then the trialists, the researchers need to go through a whole range of other internal approval processes in the LHNs. And it even becomes a whole lot more complicated if you want to employ a staff member that's employed within the LHN, because as an outsider, a SAHMRI employee or a university employee, you need somebody embedded in the LHN. And getting that approval process, even though you've got the money in your back pocket, can be incredibly complicated because there doesn't seem to be a separate process for getting an approval to appoint a staff member for research than when you're actually seem to be using the operational budget. So I think those system issues will actually be hugely important for clinical researchers, clinical scientists that have joint appointments or affiliate appointments, and we really need to get the whole precinct thing working together. I think clinician scientists who are not medical need a pathway too, and you know, Adelaide has some great allied health, nursing, clinician scientists, and they need a pathway as well. You know, the medical clinician scientist pathway certainly needs improving. The allied health nursing pathway is almost non-existent. So I think that also needs to be hugely recognised.
Thanks, Maria. Actually, this morning I was on another webinar and there was a lot of discussion about a research passport, which actually I think sounds very intriguing in that we could generate an Adelaide-wide research passport, allows data access, research access and other things across the sector, given that we are so intertwined. So I think that would be very interesting. We have a couple of questions on the Q&A, one's from Philip Weinstein, and I'm going to direct this one to Carolyn. And it goes to the question of population health research, which Philip points out has saved more lives from COVID than clinical research and practice. And do we need to rebalance the investment priorities between clinical versus population health expertise and leadership? Carolyn. You're on mute, Carolyn.
On mute. Look, I'm just, my brain is going back to the pieces within the SAPC report, and also to some work we did in the office, you know, making a submission on the strengths of South Australia in relation to the different categories of research funded through NH and MRC in particular, because they give the categories and you can do that analysis. And reasonably, the main impact in terms of where South Australia was less strong was in the clinical, was in clinical funding actually. So when one talks about addressing, firstly, a problem in a decline, for instance, something that's gone down that was previously strong, something that's a necessary working part of a system, sometimes you do need to address that element before it gets to the position where translation from that area of research and innovation is just not going to be possible. So I think the identification by the SAPC that clinical workforce research at a time when nationally it's being made really clear that this is important not only for the clinic but the community in terms of good clinical practice, is a very good diagnostic, in fact. Now, that doesn't actually make any value judgments about population health, because no one is going to query the key around the health, the population health as an area. I think what you saw was a focus on something that had, in a sense, hit a point in the decline where, unless something was brought to bear, that would have had would have taken South Australia well off the map, and for a long time would have been very difficult to recover. So my comments, and I think in terms of population health, there is no piece in the SAPC which, in a sense, plays a value. It actually takes good definitions of research across the areas of public, population, clinical, basic, allied. All of the different definitions are used. Where they've done the deep dive is where there's been, as it were, a major impact in the system, and where you can see the workforce being particularly impacted. If there's evidence that population health is on a decline in that way in South Australia, I don't think it was in the report, but you can certainly correct me on that. And therefore, if it's performing really strongly and well, that's terrific. But I don't think there's a loss of sight intended by that report of any of the key components. The ecosystem requires all of the components to come together. They can be molecular, it can be at population level, and as we've seen in COVID, you're often going between them. So you need to be able to bring the teams together to deliver the outcomes. And if you don't have one key member of that team, it's going to be really difficult wherever they are, that you will not be able to get that system to work effectively. I suppose that's my answer.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks for that. We have one other question, and that is from an anonymous attendee. Is there capacity for the university CALHN to increase the declining number of clinical academics? So, Ben, I'm waiting for you to say, you know, you're going to appoint 100 professors in 100 days here or something like that.
Well, you've said it for me, Steve, so thank you. Obviously, we had grand aspirations last year before COVID hit. We still have grand aspirations, but thinking through the logistics of that together with our health network partners is a big challenge. But it is absolutely front and centre for us in terms of initiatives that need to be pursued. Yes.
Thanks, Ben. Lesley, did you want to address that?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit more. Thank you, Ben, for sort of that commitment and challenge. I think it was curious to actually watch that it was across all of of health, and I wonder whether if we were to line up sort of where we have been successful or where we have started to decline sort of against the national picture, whether there is a strong correlation, and my guess is that there well may be. I think that, sort of we've got a little bit of work to do to, I think, almost redefine the clinical academic model. It's been a model that's been here for some time. We've now got some fairly strong direction, not only through the SAPC, but through the ambition of the various, partners across the precinct. Are we talking about clinician researchers, clinician, sort of educators, and to really make sure that we're really clear about how that we support them. I've been fortunate enough in my career, I've walked into into an organisation in the US that the only people that they employ are clinician researchers, clinician scientists. That is the reason that you come and work in these very large, sort of innovation, districts, these precincts. That's why you're there. And we've got to find a way that in actual fact describes that value, but also allows that group to provide as an uplift. It's a smallish number, but in actual fact, it's something that, I agree with Ben, we have to aspire to say, that's one of the reasons that you would choose to come and work here, that when you do, that you are able and expected to undertake research, and I mean translational research as well. You are expected to be part of the education faculty between the university and ourselves. And, we've got a tiny little bit more work to do. And, we happen to have a, clinical academic EA this year as well. And so, the main thing is to try and make sure that what we're looking at is not actually adding so many rules that they become barriers, but to actually take those down so that we're enabling them. But I have to say I was very sad to see the decline in those numbers as you produced, Caroline.
All right. Well, we have gone almost a quarter of an hour over time, but I think it was worth it because I think we've had some really good commentary from the panel and a fabulous presentation from Carolyn. So I'd really like to thank what are incredibly busy people for giving up time to talk to us about the SAPC. A great representation from our participants, and also like to mention that next week's seminar is from SA Medical Imaging, so that will also be very interesting. So thank you all, and particularly thank you to the panel and to Carolyn. Thank you very, very much.